Although unaccustomed to bad reviews at that time, and there were some, critics seemed to shy away from touching one particular element of every production, and that was the set design. Midway through season 60, Paul Kimple would celebrate his 160th set design on the Playhouse stage with a production of Wait Until Dark. And from that time on, Kimple's set designs became legendary.
A new addition to the Playhouse Arena would add another outlet for Kimple's talent. The second stage would offer smaller productions to augment the main season and started off with a smash production of Mass Appeal, which would introduce Robin McCreary to Playhouse audiences. That season would also see the first time the Playhouse staged Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, with Eric McClellan initially stepping onto the Playhouse stage. But in April of that year, both the Playhouse and Youngstown would suffer a huge loss. On April 26, 1984, a fire at neighboring Idora Park would destroy much of the park's midway, as well as the nationally known roller coaster, the Wildcat. Idora Park and the Playhouse were somewhat entwined, as the theater did many performances at the park's theater in their earlier days. Sadly, the park would totally shut down on September the 3rd of that year. As summer rolled around, the big news at Playhouse Lane was that the Playhouse would adopt the Civic Children's Theater. The CCTY always operated as a separate entity from the Playhouse. Now they would be part of the Playhouse as a Playhouse Youth Theater. That was the story as it played out in the media. Numerous sources, however, claimed that Playhouse Managing Director Bentley Lenhoff gave the CCTY no choice: either become part of the Playhouse or leave.
I think that he felt that children's theater was a wonderful way to build audiences. And if people came to children's theater as children, they might continue coming as adults. So that was one of the reasons. He was always concerned that children were seeing things that weren't top-notch. They weren't quality shows for kids for their first experience. And I think Bentley wanted the theater to have really good quality for children.
In actuality, the CCTY did leave, and the Playhouse Youth Theater was a totally new organization. Regardless of the story, their first production as the Playhouse Youth Theater was a rousing production of Peter Pan, featuring Playhouse favorite Bob Gray as Captain Hook. This success was followed by a revival of the earlier hit, Mass Appeal, this time on the main stage to accommodate audience ticket demand. The Playhouse was now on a roll, as season 61 provided one of the biggest Playhouse hits of all time, Jerome Kern's and Oscar Hammerstein's Showboat. Paul Kimple's set designs again taking center stage. As the 1985-1986 season dawned, storm clouds were brewing at the Playhouse, although unbeknownst to most everyone. Instead, attention was diverted to an exquisite production of the musical Evita, starring Fedora Anastasiadis. It also featured the return of Rick Blackson as musical director and Dennis Snyder as choreographer. Critics wildly praised the production, with Carl Schwab calling it road tour quality, and adding that it was the type of quality which had helped the Playhouse achieve their success. Talent was plentiful in this town called Youngstown, and the Playhouse was making full use of it. That is why national directors were more than happy to return and work at the Playhouse. But even with the success of Evita and the Playhouse bursting with talent, no one could have prepared anyone for what came next at Playhouse Lane. Bentley Lenhoff resigned as executive director in December of 1985. Lenhoff's resignation blindsided everyone, although there were board reports that Lenhoff had repeatedly threatened the action. In an interview with the Vindicator's Carl Schwab, Lenhoff attempted to give his side of the story.
because the board wanted to begin handling the operations of the Playhouse rather than setting policy as it had previously done. For 20 years here they had not yoked the ox that treadeth out the corn, and despite the fact that the Playhouse is doing well, both financially and artistically, they wanted to set up committees.
I think he decided to leave because he really wanted to call the shots. I mean, he really felt that he knew what was best for the theater from his standpoint. And the board really wanted to be more a part of it, and they wanted to make more decisions, and they wanted to choose the shows, and he just decided that maybe they should do it.
Several sources countered Lenhoff, saying that he was asked to leave. Lenhoff's 20-year tenure spelled nothing but success. He increased the performance season from 48 per year to 290 by 1985. The office staff grew from 6 to 20, and the operating budget rose from $65,000 in 1965 to $483,000 in 1985. By the time Lenhoff left the theater, the Playhouse ranked in the top 3 in the country. With such negative news about the Playhouse, they needed a blockbuster, something to distract local audiences from their dilemma. They got it with the hit musical, A Chorus Line. Directed and choreographed by David Gendre, it was exactly the shot in the arm the Playhouse needed at that time. Critics all over the area hailed the production, with Niles Daily Times headlining their review with, "The production of A Chorus Line, now gracing the stage of the Youngstown Playhouse, deserves a rating of Dance 10, Looks 10."
The opening night of A Chorus Line in 1986 was just an incredible experience, because I never thought we'd be able to pull it off. And it was one of the shows that Bentley always thought that I could do. And I had my doubts. But opening night, it was just like opening in a professional theater in New York. It was just so special, I will never forget it.
Dr. G. Arnold Johnson would soon be hired as a new executive director. Holding a PhD in dramatic arts and a master's in theater from Hofstra University, Johnson was well qualified for the post. With a switch in leadership, it didn't seem to hurt ticket sales. With shows like A Chorus Line and Guys and Dolls, audiences continued to purchase tickets. A glitch was about to appear, however. Not long after Arnold's hiring, the Playhouse started hiring out-of-town directors almost exclusively. Many local directors were being ignored. The cry went out that if you weren't from out of town, you didn't know anything. This move, however, seemed to shore up any anticipated weakening in production quality, with sellout productions of the comedy The Foreigner and the timely drama The Gin Game. The problems at the Playhouse, however, took a pause in the spring of 1987, as news came out of Pittsburgh that nationally noted Playhouse alum Elizabeth Biff Hartman had died by suicide at her suburban Oakland apartment. Rising rapidly to stardom with her role in the film A Patch of Blue, Hartman said, by her own admission, that her life had turned very unhappy since making that film.
Biffy was a family friend. We grew up together in Boardman, went to Boardman High School together. She was a year ahead of me. And she was quite a phenomenal little actress. Bill Dykins was the director of theater at Boardman. He was excellent. He directed, in fact, a community theater. And that year of her senior play, he chose Anastasia, because he had Biffy Hartman, who he couldn't think of anybody else to play that role but Biff, so he chose that role, that play, and it was not an easy play to do for a senior class, but she was quite talented. And a little story, just before she went to Los Angeles to work at the studio, she was in the lobby of the Playhouse one time when we were going to see a show, and I was doing lights for a production of Come Blow Your Horn. And I said to her, I said, hey, Biff, before you go out to California, why don't you and I work the light board together? And she looked at me like, I don't know whether I want to do that. And I said, we'll have a good time. So she agreed to do it. Well, Come Blow Your Horn is an easy light show. It's an up and down, and the old light board at the Playhouse was a manual light board. So you had to set every Lico on that board. And it was an easy show. But she was so nervous. We'd set up one thing, the scene would go on, then we'd have to set the next board up. We had a lot of time to do it. But she was a wreck. And she said to me after the show was over, she said, Lynn, I will never work backstage again on any show I ever do. And I said, but you had a good time, Biffy. She said, yeah, you and I had a good time. But she said, it's too much pressure for me. And after that, I never saw Biffy again. She went to California, and of course, you know, everything else is history. So she was a phenomenal actress. And the thing about Biffy was she was nominated for an Academy Award for the first thing she ever did, which was A Patch of Blue. And she was that character. That was Biffy. It was phenomenal to watch her on the screen in that role because she didn't have to act. That was Elizabeth Hartman.
The Arthur Awards that spring seemed to serve as a bit of a healing effect after the Hartman news. As they moved through the summer and into the following August, the Playhouse would take steps to be more inclusive with the black community by staging the first area production of the musical Pearlie. It was essentially the first predominantly black musical ever produced by the Playhouse. Response to the show was so gratifying that the Playhouse would produce 2 more black musicals, Ain't Misbehavin' and The Wiz, within 1 year of the Pearlie success. But Youngstown was sinking further and further into a steel-created recession. Thinking that things couldn't get much worse, the remaining sheet and tube blast furnaces in Camel, Ohio were all destroyed. The last physical vestiges of a bygone prosperous era were now gone. Youngstown needed a lift. They needed laughs. And laughs is what they got with the Playhouse production of Little Shop of Horrors, which opened the 64th season. Starring James McClellan, Sharon Van Nostrand, and Todd Hancock, it was the perfect medicine for an ailing community. The entire 64th season would be dedicated to Helen Moyer, dubbed the First Lady of the Youngstown Playhouse. Moyer had recently passed away and left a large void at the Playhouse Lane Theater. Other problems were surfacing for the Playhouse. Many actors and directors could not get work at the Playhouse, and therefore spin-off theaters started up in an attempt to give actors, directors, technicians, and audience members more entertainment options. These new theaters, in addition to the Playhouse, however, were all in competition for the same personnel. Stiff competition had arrived for the Playhouse. G. Arnold Johnson insisted that the controversy was overblown. With more types of different theater productions each theater produces, it creates positive results. Actors and technicians, however, took sides and would only work for certain theaters. But despite box office successes at the Playhouse with Cat on a Hot Tin Roof and the continuing growth of the youth theater, G. Arnold Johnson would suddenly submit his resignation. Johnson's sudden departure came only after 2 years with the theater, with some saying that he was actually fired by the board due to disagreements over his leadership style. Johnson's departure divided many at the Playhouse. As the Playhouse moved forward, again in search of an executive director, the necessity for more funds became a larger and larger problem. The theater was beginning to feel the full effects of the collapse of the steel industry in Youngstown. Large corporate contributions, which had helped to fuel the Playhouse, had now slowed to a trickle. The Playhouse was now catching up to the financial woes of Youngstown itself. Realizing the need for someone to helm the ship, the board hired former Playhouse development director Jane Hahn as the new managing director. Although Hahn did not have an immediate solution to Playhouse money problems, a production of Meredith Willson's The Music Man would infuse the theater with some badly needed cash. Serving as the Playhouse debut of Mark Frost, Music Man played to what the Playhouse sorely needed: sellout crowds. This would be followed by an ingenious production of The Odd Couple, directed by David Gendre. Both the male and female versions of the show were presented on alternating dates using many of the same actors in both versions. These successes would be bolstered in season 66, as South Pacific starring George Mansour and Holly Van Horn would be the clear hit of the season. But the rest of that season only brought modest results to the struggling box office. As season 66 faded into summer, so would Jane Hahn. Again, suddenly Hahn disappeared from the Playhouse with no apparent explanation from the theater. She would be replaced by Marlene Strollo, at least on a temporary basis. With the artistic director search in motion, it was decided that each show of the 67th season would be directed by a guest director, who would then be in the running for the artistic director spot at the Playhouse. Dial M for Murder, The Nerd, Man of La Mancha, Bus Stop, The King and I, and Broadway Bound all being directed by potential Playhouse executives. When the dust settled, Charles Reed, who directed Man of La Mancha, was the board's choice for Playhouse artistic director. But the honeymoon was short for Reed. Shortly after his arrival, disdain for Reed began to mount. Although Strollo was still occupying the top office, Reed began to make inroads into that position, culminating with the disappearance of Strollo's name from the Playhouse. Reed now moved into the top spot. The top spot, however, did not afford protection for Reed. Finances were worsening for the Playhouse. Gypsy opened the 69th season, but the rest of the season went virtually unnoticed by the public. Vindicator reviews were more and more unfavorable, and money was dwindling at a rapid rate. The Playhouse was now down 500 season ticket holders. Finally, with overwhelming financial woes, the board asked for Reed's resignation. Again, a division would form at the Playhouse between Reed loyalists and Reed detractors.
Well, Charles Reed came to the Playhouse in early 90s when we were looking for an artistic director. And the first thing he did was Beyond the Horizon, which was an obscure O'Neill play that I don't think anybody knew. No one knew this play. I mean, I do not understand why he chose this for his first show of the season, but he did, and I was his assistant director. The thing about Charles, he was an excellent actor. He also, the only other thing I knew that he did acting-wise for that year was when he starred with Vera Friedman in Driving Miss Daisy, and he played Booley, who was her son. And it was a small part, but it was memorable, and he was excellent in it. I really kind of thought that Charles was a better actor than he was a director, and that happens a lot. You're either one or the other, and the only person I know that was both was Bob Vargo, who I worked with a couple of times in shows, and he was a good director and a good actor. But most of the time it's one or the other where you excel. And I think that Charles Reed really was a much better actor than he was a director.
Rumors now spread rapidly that the Playhouse would have to close its doors. Without some appreciable influx of funds, the Playhouse would not be able to continue. Many Playhouse people felt that the hiring of Charles Reed was the beginning of the downfall of the Youngstown Playhouse. But however dim, there was a light at the end of that long, dark tunnel. Enter the musical Nunsense, which was a replacement for the last scheduled show that season. Featuring Paula McConnell, Sis Solar, Lois E. Thornton, Regina Reese, Arlene Smith-Ivan, and Tara General-Ovich, the show was the medicine the Playhouse needed. It was a huge hit. Even the Vindicator echoed the success. The show was held over by popular demand. With the fresh success of Nunsense behind them, the Playhouse would hire Gerald R. Smith as managing director and elect Douglas Everett as the new Playhouse president. But as so often happened at the Playhouse, happiness was tempered with sadness as the news of the passing of longtime Playhouse veteran John Abbey was announced. The Playhouse needed to take time and catch its collective breath as it took a look at the next decade to come.